Kamala Harris made three fatal mistakes that night. First, she agreed to debate someone who actually prepares. Second, she brought her signature cackle to a facts fight. Third, she forgot that Ben Shapiro speaks at 200 words per minute and had already researched all 47 times she'd said, "I was a prosecutor," while doing the exact opposite of prosecuting. The Fox News producers thought they were being clever. They set up a criminal justice and border security debate, pitting the former prosecutor and current VP against the conservative podcast host. It should be good television, they figured. Harris would use her top cop credentials to dominate, while Shapiro would talk fast and get some sound bites. Standard cable news fare. What they didn't anticipate was that Ben Shapiro doesn't just talk fast, he thinks faster. And he'd spent the last week doing what Kamala's staff apparently never does. Actually reading her record. Every brief she'd filed, every conviction she'd pursued, every position she'd abandoned. Every time she'd said, "as a prosecutor," followed by something prosecutors don't do. He'd cataloged it, time-stamped it, and loaded it onto his laptop with the enthusiasm of a rabbinical scholar who'd just discovered a new Talmudic contradiction to explore. Kamala walked onto that stage at exactly 8:59 p.m. in her standard uniform, a pantsuit that cost more than the average American makes in a month, that practiced smile that never reaches her eyes, and most importantly, that laugh, that cackle, that has launched 1,000 memes and destroyed 1,000 uncomfortable moments when she didn't know what else to say. She was ready to talk about being a prosecutor, even though her record would suggest otherwise. Ready to discuss her experience, even though her approval rating suggested Americans weren't impressed. Ready to deploy the cackle the moment things got uncomfortable, which, given her track record in unscripted settings, would be approximately 90 seconds in. Ben Shapiro walked on stage at exactly 9:00 p.m., looking like what he is, a 5'9" Orthodox Jewish Harvard law graduate who'd discovered that talking really fast meant he could dismantle bad arguments before his opponents even finished making them. He wore a simple suit, his yarmulke, and an expression that said, "I've read every word you've ever said publicly, and I've brought receipts for all of them." He sat down, opened his laptop, adjusted his microphone, and did what he always does in the 3 seconds before a debate starts. Took a deep breath and mentally calculated how many words per minute he'd need to deploy to get through his entire argument list tonight. Tonight's calculation, 200 WPM would be fine. 250 if she interrupted. 300 if she cackled. The moderator, Brett Baer, opened with a question about border security. A softball territory for Kamala, since she'd been appointed border czar. She launched into her answer about root causes and humane immigration policy and the need to address the underlying factors. Ben interrupted, not rudely, just efficiently, the way a surgeon interrupts someone trying to operate with a butter knife. "Madam Vice President, forgive me, but I did the math before we started. You were appointed border czar on March 24, 2021. That's 1,381 days ago. You visited the actual border one time, June 25, 2021, and only after President Trump announced he was going. You spent approximately 4 hours there. That's 1.19% of your time as border czar actually at the border. I spend more time waiting in line at the DMV. Meanwhile, 8 million illegal crossings occurred. That's 5,800 per day, 242 per hour, 4 per minute. While you were talking just now about root causes, approximately 12 people crossed illegally. So my question is, how can you be border czar if you're not at the border? That's like being a lifeguard who's never been to the pool." The audience laughed. Kamala's smile froze. And then, right on schedule, like clockwork, like the sun rising, came the cackle. Well, I mean, cackle. That's a very simplistic view of a complex. I'm sorry, did you just laugh? Ben's eyebrows shot up. I just told you 12 people crossed illegally while you were deflecting, and you laughed. Is illegal immigration funny to you? Should we schedule this debate during peak crossing hours so you can laugh at more of it? The cackle stopped. The smile vanished. And for the first time in her political career, Kamala Harris realized she was in a debate with someone who'd actually prepared, who talked faster than she could deflect, and who had turned her verbal tics into a drinking game for the audience at home. What happened in the next 90 minutes wasn't a debate. It was a 200 words per minute systematic dismantling of everything Kamala Harris has ever claimed to be. The former prosecutor met an actual arguer. The word salad chef met a logical meat grinder. The cackle met someone who'd counted exactly how many times she'd deployed it. And every time she tried to laugh her way out of a tough question, Ben would stop, time it, and ask, "Was that a nervous laugh? Or do you genuinely find this amusing?" "I'm genuinely curious because I've studied your laugh patterns, and you deploy it specifically when confronted with facts you can't refute. It's like a verbal panic button. If you think I'm exaggerating, you haven't seen someone who speaks 200 words per minute systematically destroy someone who uses 200 words to say nothing. Facts don't care about your cackle. And Ben Shapiro brought all the facts. Brett Baer tried to regain control. "Vice President Harris, would you like to respond to—" She would. Ben interrupted again. "But first, let me finish the math, because Americans deserve context. Madame Vice President, the border is 1,912 miles long. You visited El Paso, which is approximately 10 miles of that border. You saw 0.51% of the border for 4 hours. Then you went back to Washington and didn't return. That was 3 years ago." He pulled up a chart on his laptop, angling it toward the camera. "Here's a timeline I prepared. March 24th, 2021. Biden appoints you border czar. March 25th. You all say you're honored and will address root causes. April 2021. Border Patrol encounters hit 178,000. You don't visit. May 2021. 180,000 encounters. You don't visit. June 2021. Trump announces he's going to the border. Suddenly, coincidentally, you schedule a visit. June 25th. You spend 4 hours in El Paso, one of the safest sections. You leave. July, August, September, October, November, December. Nothing. 2022, nothing. 2023, nothing. 2024, we are still waiting." Kamala tried to interrupt. Ben kept going, his words machine gun precise. "Meanwhile, during your tenure as border czar, a title your office later tried to deny you ever had, which is interesting, 8 million illegal border crossings occurred. That's more than the population of Virginia. Fentanyl seized at the border increased 400%. Overdose deaths hit under 70,000 per year. Border Patrol agents are quitting at record rates because they're overwhelmed. Texas Governor Abbott started busing migrants to blue cities because the federal government, your responsibility, failed to act. And when reporters asked you about visiting the border, you said, quote, 'I haven't been to Europe either.' You laughed at a border crisis that killed 70,000 Americans from fentanyl alone." He finally paused and looked directly at her. "So my question is simple. Were you incompetent or just absent? Because those are the only two options that explain how someone assigned to handle a crisis visits the crisis zone once in 4 years. Kamala's smile was gone now. She leaned forward, deploying her prosecutor voice. As someone who has worked on immigration issues, it's not complex, Ben interrupted at speed. Now it's simple. Secure the border. That's it. That's the entire job. But your administration ended Remain in Mexico, stopped building the wall, released hundreds of thousands into the interior with court dates years away that they'll never attend. You didn't fail to solve a complex problem. You actively made it worse. And then you didn't even show up to witness what you'd created. He pulled up more data. According to Border Patrol's own statistics, which are publicly available and which I printed out because I assumed you wouldn't have them, gotaways, people who evade capture, number approximately during your tenure. We don't know who they are, where they went, or what they're doing here. That's roughly the population of Phoenix, just gone into America. No vetting, no tracking, nothing. The Border Patrol does heroic work, Kamala tried. They do, Ben agreed immediately, which is why they're demoralized that you won't let them do their jobs. I've read their union statements. They say the administration has handcuffed them. They're processing asylum claims instead of securing borders. They're babysitters instead of law enforcement. And their morale is destroyed by your policies that you won't even show up to defend in person at the border. He leaned back, satisfied. You were appointed border czar. You visited once, for 4 hours, to the safest section 3 years ago. 8 million illegal crossings happened. 70,000 Americans died from fentanyl. Border Patrol is collapsing. And when asked about it, you laughed and said you hadn't been to Europe either. Madam Vice President, Europe isn't your job. The border is, and you didn't do it. Kamala opened her mouth to respond. Ben held up a hand. Oh, and before you say, I was a prosecutor, we're getting to that. Spoiler alert, that record isn't going to help you either. The audience applauded. Kamala's cackle was nowhere to be found. She'd learned the first rule of debating Ben Shapiro. He talks faster than you can deflect. And folks, Ben was just warming up. He speaks 200 words per minute when relaxed. Now he was motivated. Subscribe. Ben didn't wait for the next question. He just transitioned seamlessly, the way someone who debates for a living knows how to do. You said you've worked on immigration issues. Let's discuss your prosecutorial record, since you mention it frequently. By my count, you said, I was a prosecutor, or as a prosecutor, 47 times during your 2020 campaign. I counted. My staff counted. We made a supercut. It's on YouTube. But let's examine what kind of prosecutor you actually were. He pulled up a new document. San Francisco District Attorney, 2004 to 2011. You ran as a progressive prosecutor. That was your brand. Smart on crime, not just tough on crime. Sounds great. Let's look at the results. During your tenure, you oversaw approximately 1,900 marijuana possession convictions. 1,900 people, disproportionately young, disproportionately poor, disproportionately minority, convicted for possessing marijuana. Then, years later, when asked if you'd ever smoked marijuana yourself, you laughed and said yes. You laughed about smoking the substance you'd convicted .90s for possessing. That's not hypocrisy. That's aristocratic contempt for the people whose lives you destroyed while doing the same thing they did. Kamala tried to interject. Ben was already 3 sentences ahead. But it gets worse. In 2014, your office argued in court to deny parole to prisoners who'd served their sentences because, quote, prisons would lose an important labor pool. Let me repeat that. Your office the California Attorney General's office, which you ran, argued to keep people in prison beyond their sentences because they were being used for cheap labor. That's prison slavery, Madam Vice President. You fought to keep people enslaved for labor. That's not criminal justice reform. That's the 13th Amendment's exception clause being exploited by someone who claims to care about justice. He pulled out more cases. Daniel Larson, wrongfully convicted. DNA and other evidence proved his innocence. Your office fought his release for procedural reasons. You wanted to keep an innocent man in prison because letting him out would be administratively inconvenient. He spent extra years in prison because you couldn't admit a mistake. George Gage, convicted based on false testimony from a police officer. Officer got caught lying in multiple cases. Your office fought to uphold Gage's conviction anyway. Kept him in prison despite the evidence being tainted. Ben was hitting 275 DUPM now. Kevin Cooper, on death row. Substantial evidence of innocence. New DNA testing could potentially prove it. You opposed the testing. You fought against evidence that could exonerate a man facing execution, not because you believed he was guilty. You couldn't know without the testing, but because testing would be inconvenient to the conviction. He looked up. You want to know the pattern? You were tough on poor people who couldn't fight back, but you were soft on prosecutorial misconduct, police misconduct, and systemic problems. You climbed the political ladder on the backs of people you incarcerated, many wrongfully, and then you ran as a progressive reformer. That's not evolution. That's whitewashing. Kamala finally got a word in. As Attorney General, I was bound by law to defend convictions. You had discretion, Ben shot back immediately. Prosecutors have enormous discretion. You chose to exercise yours to keep innocent people in prison and to defend dirty convictions. You chose to prosecute 900 to 900 people for marijuana while smoking it yourself. You chose to fight to keep people in prison beyond their sentences for labor. Those were choices, your choices. Don't blame the law for your moral failures. He pulled up the famous clip. And let's not forget, Tulsi Gabbard destroyed you on this exact issue in the July 2019 debate. She said, quote, she put over 1,500 people in jail for marijuana violations and then laughed about it when she was asked if she ever smoked marijuana. You had no response except to look uncomfortable and deflect. Because she was right. Your prosecutorial record is a monument to hypocrisy and cruelty disguised as public service. Ben leaned forward. So when you say, I was a prosecutor, what you're actually saying is, I locked up poor people for doing what I did, kept innocent people in prison when evidence showed they were innocent, and fought to maintain prison slavery. That's your record. That's what you're bragging about. And you want us to think that makes you qualified for leadership? Kamala's face was red. The cackle was trying to surface, but dying in her throat. She started a sentence 3 times and abandoned it each time. Ben waited exactly 1.5 seconds, enough to be polite, not enough for her to gather thoughts, and moved on. Now, let's discuss your presidential campaign. This should be quick, because spoiler alert, so was your campaign. 2 rounds in, Kamala was already doing the nervous laugh. 6 more rounds to go. Keep watching. Ben pulled up polling data with the practiced ease of someone who'd memorized every number. January 27, 2019, you announced your presidential campaign to 20,000 people in Oakland. The media called you the female Obama. You were at 12% in national polls. 9 months later, December 3, 2019, you dropped out before the Iowa caucuses. You were at 3%. What happened? He didn't wait for her to answer because he already had the answer loaded. What happened is, voters met you. You peaked early on vibes and identity. First Indian American, first black woman AG and senator. Historic barrier breaker. All the identity boxes checked. Great. Then people asked what you stood for, and you had no answer. Let me demonstrate. Ben started cycling through video clips on the screen. Rapid fire. Medicare for all. You were for it, then against it, then for access to it, which means nothing. Fracking. You said clearly, quote, "There's no question I'm in favor of banning fracking." Then, in the VP debate, you said Joe Biden will not ban fracking. So, which is it? Borders. You wanted to decriminalize illegal crossings in 2019. In 2024, you claimed to support border security. Police? You supported defund the police movements in 2020, raised money for bail funds that freed rioters. In 2024, you're back to "I was a prosecutor, I'm tough on crime." You don't have positions. You have focus groups. He pulled up internal campaign documents that had leaked. Your campaign was a disaster. Highest staff turnover of any campaign. Your campaign manager resigned. Multiple staffers quit, citing, and I'm quoting from Politico here, an abusive environment, saying you refused to read briefings, were unprepared for meetings, and berated staff for her own failures. You weren't just losing. You were a terrible boss while losing. Ben showed the polling collapse. You started at 12%. By July, after Tulsi destroyed you in that debate, you dropped to 8%. By September, 5%. By November, 3%. You were losing your home state of California in hypothetical matchups. Let me repeat that. You couldn't win California, the most liberal state in America, your own state, against Joe Biden, who's from Delaware. He pulled up the fundraising numbers. You raised over $40 million. You spent it all. You ended your campaign $3 million in debt. You couldn't even manage your campaign finances. And you want to manage the country's finances? But here's my favorite part, Ben said, his speed increasing to 300 WPM. Pure enthusiasm now. You dropped out on December 3rd, 2019. The Iowa caucuses were February 3rd, 2020, exactly 2 months away. You couldn't even make it to the first contest. You quit before a single vote was cast because you knew you'd be humiliated. You weren't polling viable in Iowa. You weren't polling viable in New Hampshire. You were going to get destroyed, so you quit. He paused for effect. And you know who was still in the race when you quit? Marianne Williamson, the crystal healing lady. The woman who talks to angels. She outlasted you. You were less politically viable than the woman who thinks we can defeat nuclear weapons with love. That's not a campaign. That's a humiliation speed run. Kamala tried to defend herself. I'm proud of the campaign we ran. You ran it into the ground, Ben said flatly. You raised $40 million, went into debt, couldn't win your own state, got destroyed by Tulsi Gabbard, had mass staff resignations, polled at 3%, and quit before Iowa. The only thing you should be proud of is recognizing you needed to quit. That's the single good decision you made. Admitting defeat. Though even that you did poorly. Because you quit so early, it looked like you were running away. He pulled up one more clip. And then, despite this spectacular failure, despite Democratic voters rejecting you so thoroughly, you couldn't get 3%. Despite not receiving a single primary vote, Joe Biden picked you as VP. Why? He told us why. He publicly stated he'd choose a woman. Then he narrowed it to a woman of color. That eliminated 94% of Americans. You weren't chosen for competence. You were chosen because you checked demographic boxes. You're the ultimate diversity hire. That's offensive, Kamala started. It's accurate, Ben corrected. Biden literally said he'd choose based on demographics. That's the definition of a diversity hire. And you've spent the last 4 years proving why choosing leaders for their identity, rather than their qualifications, produces the results we've seen. Speaking of which, let's discuss your vice presidency. This won't take long, because you haven't accomplished much. 3 rounds, Kamala's greatest hits, turning into lowlights. Share if you remember this disaster. Ben pulled up approval ratings with visible relish. Let's discuss your vice presidency. You have a 28% approval rating. That's the lowest for any vice president in the history of polling. Lower than Dick Cheney after he shot his friend in the face. Let that sink in. You're less popular than the guy who shot someone. He showed the graph. You started at 49% approval in February 2021. Within 6 months, you dropped to 42%. By the end of your first year, 35%. Now you're at 28%. That's a 21-point drop in approval, one of the steepest declines ever recorded. Americans got to know you and decided they didn't like what they saw. But the numbers aren't the worst part. Ben continued. The worst part is what you've actually done, or more accurately, haven't done. You were given assignments. Let's review them. Assignment 1, Border czar. We covered that. Grade F, 8 million illegal crossings. 1 visit, 0 solutions. Assignment 2, voting rights. You were supposed to pass voting rights legislation. You gave speeches. You traveled. You met with activists. You accomplished exactly nothing. No legislation passed. Grade of Assignment 3, root causes of migration. You went to Guatemala. You told migrants, do not come. They came anyway, in record numbers. You accomplished nothing except looking condescending to Central Americans. Grade F. Then he pulled up staffing data. But here's the most telling metric. Staff turnover in your first 2 years as VP. 92% of your staff quit or was fired. 92%. For comparison, Mike Pence had 18% turnover. Biden as VP had 25%. You have 92%. Why? Because according to reports from Politico, The Washington Post, The New York Times, not conservative outlets, mainstream news, you're impossible to work for. He read from the reports. She doesn't read briefing materials. She's unprepared for meetings. She blames staff for her failures. She creates a culture of fear and misery. That's not from the Daily Wire. That's from the Washington Post. Your own party's media is reporting you're an abusive boss who doesn't do the work. Ben showed international trip footage. Then there are your international embarrassments. Poland. You laughed when discussing the refugee crisis. France. You deployed the worst fake French accent in diplomatic history. Africa. You were condescending and bizarre. Every trip became a viral moment of cringe. You're supposed to represent America abroad. Instead, you embarrass us. But let's discuss the biggest problem, Ben said, slowing down for emphasis. When Biden dropped out in 2024, or was pushed out, depending on who you believe, the party installed you as the nominee. Not one American voted for you. Not one primary was held. Not one debate occurred. You were installed because there was no time to do it properly. You're the nominee by default, by circumstance, by being the VP when Biden collapsed. He leaned forward. That's not democracy. That's coronation. The party that claims to defend democracy didn't give Democratic voters a choice. They gave them you, the woman who got 3% in 2020 and dropped out before Iowa. The woman with 28% approval. The woman who can't keep staff. The woman who couldn't win her own state in a primary. And now you're the nominee. That's not inspiring. That's desperate. Kamala tried to push back. The American people will have their say in November. They had their say in 2019 and 2019, Ben interrupted. They said no, decisively, overwhelmingly. You got 3%. Now, you're the nominee anyway because you checked the right demographic boxes in 2020. You're here not because you earned it through primary victories, not because voters chose you, but because you were the diversity hire who was standing closest when the music stopped. That's not a pathway to the presidency. That's an indictment of a broken system that prioritizes identity over competence. 4 rounds. The top cop was looking more like a flop VP. More devastation coming. Ben pulled up a split screen showing Kamala in 2019 and 2024. Let's discuss your policy positions, or more accurately, your complete lack of consistent policy positions, because you change them based on which way the wind is blowing. He started with health care, Medicare for all. In January 2019, you co-sponsored Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All bill. You said, quote, "Sweet, I'm with Bernie on Medicare for all." You raised your hand at the debate saying you'd eliminate private insurance. Then your poll numbers dropped. By July, you were walking it back. By September, you released a plan that kept private insurance. By October, you claimed you'd never really supported eliminating private insurance, even though there's video of you saying exactly that. Which position do you actually hold? Nobody knows, including probably you. Fracking, Ben continued, rapid fire. September 2019 CNN Town Hall. You were asked directly, would you ban fracking? You said, quote, "There's no question I'm in favor of banning fracking." Clear statement. Unambiguous. Then you became VP nominee. Suddenly, in the VP debate, you said Biden wouldn't ban fracking. Pence confronted you. You denied ever supporting a ban. He said, "You said it. You said you didn't, but we have you on video saying it." You lied about your own recorded position. Ben pulled up border clips. Immigration, 2019. Democratic debate. You supported decriminalizing illegal border crossings. You raised your hand on video. Then you compared ICE to the KKK. Direct quote, "There's a human rights abuse being committed by the United States government." You wanted to abolish ICE. Then you became border czar, and suddenly you're talking about border security. Which is it? Open borders or security? You've been on both sides. Police. In 2020, during the riots, you promoted a bail fund for people arrested during the George Floyd protests, the Minnesota Freedom Fund. You tweeted asking people to donate. That fund bailed out people charged with violent crimes. Then, as crime spiked, you went back to, "I was a prosecutor." You can't have it both ways. You can't raise money to free violent criminals and then claim to be tough on crime. He showed the compilation. Criminal justice. As prosecutor, you were tough on crime. As presidential candidate, you were a reformer. As VP, you're back to tough. Energy. You supported the Green New Deal. Now you support all of the above. Guns. You said you'd use executive action for gun control. Now you're quieter on it. Student loans. You supported total forgiveness. Now it's income-based caps. Ben leaned forward. You have no core beliefs. You have no principles. You're a political weather vane. You point whichever direction you think will get you votes. That's not leadership. That's opportunism. And voters can tell the difference. Politicians evolve, Kamala tried. Politicians evolve over years or decades, Ben said. You evolved between primary debates. You evolved from supporting Medicare for all to opposing it in 6 months. That's not evolution. That's desperation. You take whatever position polls well, then abandon it when it doesn't. That's not conviction. That's calculation. And bad calculation, because voters see through it. He pulled up one final comparison. Here's the bottom line. Nobody knows what you actually believe because you don't consistently believe anything, except that Kamala Harris should have power. That's not a platform. That's naked ambition. And America deserves leaders who stand for something more than their own advancement. 7 rounds. One more. The knockout punch about the laugh. Ben took a breath. This was it. The final round that would cement everything. I've saved the best for last. Your laugh. That cackle. That sound that launches 1,000 memes and ends 1,000 serious moments. Let's analyze it scientifically. He pulled up a compilation video he'd personally edited. Because, of course, he had. Watch the pattern. I'm going to show you exactly when you deploy the cackle. The clips played. Reporter asks about visiting border. Cackle. Asked about Biden's cognitive health. Cackle. Asked about inflation. Cackle. Confronted with her prosecutorial record. Cackle. Asked about staff turnover. Cackle. Poland. Discussing refugee crisis. Inappropriate. Cackle. Ben stopped the video. Notice the pattern. You laugh when you're uncomfortable. When you're asked tough questions. When you don't have an answer. When you're confronted with your own failures. It's not joy. It's not humor. It's a nervous tick. It's a defense mechanism. It's what you do when your brain can't formulate an actual response. He pulled up analysis from body language experts. I consulted with 3 separate behavioral psychologists. All 3 independently confirmed. Your laugh is a stress response. It's what psychologists call a self-soothing behavior. When faced with uncomfortable situations, you laugh to deflect, to buy time, to avoid having to give a substantive answer. Here's the problem, Ben continued. It makes you seem unserious. When there's a refugee crisis and you laugh, it seems callous. When Americans are struggling with inflation and you laugh, it seems dismissive. When confronted with your failures and you laugh, it seems like you don't care. I don't think you're trying to be callous. I think you're just uncomfortable, and your brain defaults to laughter. But the effect is the same. You appear unfit for serious leadership. He showed polling data. And voters notice. When asked why they don't support you, the laugh appears consistently in focus groups. She doesn't take things seriously. She laughs at inappropriate times. That cackle is grating. It's one of your most well-known characteristics, and it's negative. Ben pulled up a timer. I'm going to prove my point. I'm going to ask you a tough question. Let's see if you can answer without laughing. Ready? Why did you keep innocent people in prison when evidence showed they were wrongfully convicted? Kamala started to answer. Her mouth opened. She began to form words, and then cackle. It wasn't even a full laugh, just the start of one. But it was enough. Ben stopped the timer. 4.8 seconds. Not even a full second before the nervous laugh started. You can't help it. When confronted with your actual record, with real questions about your actions, your brain short-circuits and produces that sound. He leaned forward. Here's what that tells me. You know your record is indefensible. You know you made bad decisions. You know you hurt people. And when confronted with it, you can't defend it, so you laugh. That's not confidence. That's cognitive dissonance. Your brain knows you did wrong, but your ego won't admit it. So it produces this bizarre laugh as a release valve. Ben slowed down, emphasizing each word. A president faces pressure every single day. Life and death decisions, international crises, economic emergencies. If your response to pressure is to laugh nervously and hope it goes away, you're not ready for the job. You weren't ready to be VP. Your approval ratings prove it. You weren't ready to be a presidential candidate. Your 3% polling proved it. And you're certainly not ready to be taken seriously when you can't even answer tough questions without that cackle. Kamala tried one more time. I think... No, Ben interrupted gently. We've heard enough. 90 minutes of what you think. And America has learned everything it needs to know. Now let me tell you what I think. Ben Shapiro stood up, all 5'9" of him, and for the first time all night spoke slowly. Not because he was running out of words, but because he wanted every single one to land. Madam Vice President, let me summarize what we've learned tonight. You were appointed border czar. You visited the border once. 8 million illegal crossings occurred. 70,000 Americans died from fentanyl. You laughed when asked about visiting the border. You were a prosecutor who locked up poor people for marijuana while smoking it yourself. You kept innocent people in prison. You fought to maintain prison labor. You climbed into politics on the backs of people you incarcerated. Your presidential campaign collapsed to 3%. You couldn't win your own state. You dropped out before Iowa. Democratic voters rejected you completely. Then you were installed as VP nominee based on demographics, not merit. As vice president, you have 28% approval, the lowest in history. Your staff quits at record rates, 92% turnover. You can't articulate coherent thoughts without a teleprompter. You produce word salads that mean nothing. You launched your career by dating a powerful married man who gave you $167,000 in patronage appointments. You didn't rise through merit. You rose through connections and patronage. You flip-flop on every issue. You have no core beliefs. You're a political weather vane who points wherever you think votes are, and you laugh inappropriately, constantly, whenever you're uncomfortable, which is whenever you're asked to defend your record. Ben's speed increased, building to a crescendo. You represent everything wrong with modern politics. You were chosen for your identity, not your competence. You've been given every opportunity, prosecutor, AG, senator, VP, and you've failed at all of them. Your approval ratings prove it. Your staff turnover proves it. Your inability to win a primary proves it. You don't stand for anything except Kamala Harris's advancement. You don't believe in anything except Kamala Harris's power. You're the ultimate empty vessel. Pretty words with no substance, laughter with no joy, ambition with no accomplishment. And here's the tragedy. You could have been great. You had the positions, you had the platform, but you wasted it because you're fundamentally unserious. You don't do the work. You don't read the briefings. You don't prepare. You just show up, say words that mean nothing, laugh when challenged, and expect identity politics to carry you through. Ben looked directly at the camera. America deserves better. America deserves leaders chosen for competence, not demographics. Leaders who do the work, not avoid it. Leaders who can articulate clear positions, not produce word salads. Leaders who take serious issues seriously, not laugh them off. He looked back at Kamala. You're not that leader. You never were. And every day you stay in office, you prove it. The audience erupted, some in applause, some in shock, some probably just processing, having watched someone speak 300 words per minute for 90 minutes while systematically dismantling a political career. Kamala sat frozen. No cackle this time, just silence. Because what do you say when someone has spent 90 minutes documenting every failure, every flip-flop, every laugh, every word salad, every empty promise? Ben Shapiro closed his laptop, adjusted his yarmulke, and walked off stage at exactly 10:30 p.m. He'd spoken approximately 18,000 words. Kamala had spoken approximately 3,000, most of them meaningless. Facts don't care about your feelings. They don't care about your cackle. They don't care about your identity. They just are. And Ben Shapiro had brought all of them. The video went nuclear. Within 3 hours, it had 150 million views across all platforms. Within 12 hours, it became the most watched political content in Internet history. Within 24 hours, even CNN was playing clips with the caption, "Kamala Harris struggles in Fox debate." Ben Shapiro destroys Kamala Harris became the #1 search term on YouTube. The video had more views than the Super Bowl, more engagement than any presidential debate, more shares than any political event in modern history. But it wasn't just conservatives sharing it. Moderates were sharing it. Independents were sharing it. Even some Democrats were quietly sharing it with the caption, "We need a better candidate." The cackle became toxic overnight. Every time Kamala laughed in a subsequent appearance, Twitter exploded with, "There it is," and "nervous laugh confirmed." Late-night comedians who usually protected her started doing segments on the laugh. SNL did a cold open entirely about her inability to answer questions without cackling. Her approval rating, already at 28%, dropped to 22% within a week. Internal Democratic polling showed her losing to Trump by 12 points. Swing states were gone. Even blue states were competitive. The party that had installed her without a primary began to panic. Staffers quit in droves. Her VP office went from 92% turnover to complete collapse. Just a skeleton crew remained. Word leaked that she'd watched the debate, laughed nervously, of course, and said that wasn't fair. Her remaining staff reportedly told her, "Actually, it was just your record." Willie Brown, now 90, gave an interview where he admitted, "Maybe I helped her too much, too early." Translation: even her political godfather was distancing himself. The flip-flop compilations went viral. Republican ads in every state showed her supporting Medicare for all, then opposing it, supporting banning fracking, then denying she ever said it. The ads wrote themselves, just play her own words. Democrats began discussing contingency plans. Could they replace her before the election? Legal experts debated. Party insiders leaked to friendly journalists that concerns are growing. Translation: they wanted her gone, but didn't know how. 3 weeks after the debate, a major Democratic donor told the New York Times, "We chose someone for demographics who wasn't ready. That's on us, but we can't keep pretending she's ready now." Even her own party was done pretending. Ben Shapiro, meanwhile, became even more influential. The Daily Wire's subscriptions doubled. His podcast hit #1 globally. Universities invited him to speak, even liberal ones, because students had watched him systematically dismantle arguments with facts and logic and wanted to learn how. "Facts don't care about your feelings" became the slogan of an entire generation of young people who'd watched someone win a debate not through emotion, identity, or charm, but through preparation, evidence, and rapid-fire articulation. 6 months later, in retrospectives about the 2024 election, political scientists cited the Shapiro-Harris debate as the moment identity politics died, not because identity doesn't matter, it does, but because the debate proved that identity without competence, demographics without merit, representation without qualification produces leaders who can't lead. Kamala Harris had been given every advantage. Chosen for her gender and race, appointed VP despite a failed campaign, given assignments and platforms, and she'd failed at all of them. Not because of discrimination, but because of lack of preparation, lack of substance, and that nervous cackle every time reality confronted narrative. Ben Shapiro had brought facts. Kamala had brought a cackle. Facts won. Ben Shapiro did what mainstream media wouldn't do. He held Kamala Harris accountable for her record, using nothing but her own words, actions, and that laugh. No personal attacks. Just 200 words per minute of documented failures, flip-flops, and incompetence. Kamala Harris represented everything wrong with identity politics. Choosing leaders for demographics over merit, promoting people beyond their competence, protecting them from accountability because of their identity, and then watching them fail spectacularly because identity doesn't govern, doesn't secure borders, doesn't articulate coherent policy. She was given every advantage and proved why merit matters. She was chosen for who she was, not what she could do. And she couldn't do it. Share this with everyone tired of empty politicians chosen for the wrong reasons. Comment: should leaders be chosen for competence or demographics? Because this debate proved what happens when you choose wrong. Facts don't care about your feelings, your identity, your narrative, or your cackle. They just are. And when someone who speaks 200 words per minute brings all of them, no amount of laughing can make them go away. The age of identity politics over competence is ending. The receipts are being collected. The facts are being deployed. And sometimes, the cackle finally stops.